have this capacity to be both on the pitch and observing yourself on the pitch. So all it takes is a nanosecond shift in attention from distraction to attention, and it can be trained.
So
let me, carry on, Lee.
So first of all, for those of us, what is the pitch, Deborah?
The pitch is, it could be in the operating theatre. If you're, medical staff, it could be in a busy team meeting. It could be having to make a decision in front of a board. Yeah. So on the pitch, does that mean something else in the US?
Yeah. So we don't know what on the pitch means over here.
Oh, on the field?
Perfect. Okay. But yes, it applies to the OR, to the boardroom, to the surgical holding area, everything you just said. I just wanted to make sure our listeners
okay.
Hello, and welcome to the Fire Chief Podcast, the only podcast dedicated to the Chief Medical Officer. I am your host, Lee Scheinbart, and this podcast brings you the hottest and most crucial conversations in healthcare and physician leadership right now. And now, across the globe. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, we are going global today. Today's guest joins us from across the pond and is a leader's leader when it comes to global and sustainable change. Deborah Rowland has over 35 years of experience in organizational change, and along with her prolific pioneering and extensively published original research about key factors required for successful transformation, she has become a leading practitioner in the field of leadership and change. Deborah earned a first-class honors degree in archaeology and anthropology from Cambridge University and worked in many different cultures and industries across the globe, including as a VP in organizational and management development roles at Shell, Gucci Group, BBC Worldwide, and PepsiCo, and in a coaching role with the Church of England, Dell Computers, and GlaxoSmithKline, just to name a few. Currently, at her consultant firm, Still Moving, Deborah's passion is to work with senior leaders and top teams to deliver interventions in a sustainable and more effortless fashion, especially to help them see the choices available to them in implementing change. Deborah's work also includes several books on leadership and change, and just recently published her fourth book, From Ought to Is, Catalyzing Change and Movement in a Polarized World, which if I could attempt to unfairly and apologetically distill to this notion when dealing with what ought to be versus what is, leaders and organizations often get stuck by ideals, norms, or expectations, the ought, that may not account for the real messy present. So, Deborah, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Lee. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, it's my honor, and it is a privilege to have you on the podcast. As you know, this show began with the idea of sharing stories of chief medical officers who have experienced just about any manner of crisis in the midst of incredible tensions and the big messiness of U.S. healthcare. But it has evolved to capture those lessons and how they manifest into leadership skills for our listeners, most of whom have prominent roles in healthcare organizations or aspire to those roles. And further, as I mentioned to you when we first connected, I have a particular passion of my own, which is to teach aspiring physician leaders the specifics about the role of the chief medical officer and, again, that messy healthcare environment and the leadership requirements that they must have to succeed. So let's start with some foundational elements, and then we'll dig into all these mysteries that you have deciphered about leadership and change. So physician leaders operate in environments of intense stress, risk, and regulation, and you put a lot of emphasis on the inner state, mindfulness, awareness, emotional self-regulation as a starting point in leadership. So let's start with, how do you think physician leaders, or any leader for that matter, can cultivate those inner capacities given the time constraints, their clinical demands, and the cultural expectations of medicine in general?
Yeah, great question to start us off with, Lee. And what I find fascinating when I first got into this field of mindfulness and all the research around it is that it was in precisely high-stress environments where the original research was done, whether that was US Army, whether it was athletes in the sport world where you're having to perform under pressure with competition in a small amount of time. So how can one get control of one's mind in a high pressurized environment? So I was quite fascinated because obviously in the world of business where I've mainly been in, there's an equivalent atmosphere. Sometimes you have to make very, very split-minute decisions. So, all of these studies show, whether that's in healthcare or in combat or in high-performance sport, that the capacity to be in the present moment, to really focus, increase one's empathy, the capacity to connect with what's happening in the here and now moment without distraction, the heightened awareness and sense-making capability is so strongly correlated with outcomes and success. I mean, it's just incontrovertible. So, yeah. So I think I've sold the case for why mindfulness matters. But your question is how to cultivate them. So here's the key thing that I've had to learn. It doesn't mean going away to meditate for 2 weeks. It doesn't mean having to roll out your yoga mat. It doesn't mean having to put chimes in your office and chant. This is a lot of, I think, to dispel a bit of the myth around mindfulness, but it's the capacity to train the mind to be in the present moment, to, as it were, get on the balcony of your life and to be able to witness yourself on the playing field at the same time as you're in the midst of the action. And the brain can do that. It has both a left and a right hemisphere. So the brain is capable of observing what's going on in the brain. It's a marvelous thing. I'm sure a lot of your listeners, if they're in the neuroscience world, knows that the human beings have this capacity to be both on the pitch and observing yourself on the pitch. So all it takes is a nanosecond shift in attention from distraction to attention, and it can be trained. So let me, carry on, Lee.
So first of all, for those of us, what is the pitch, Deborah?
The pitch is, it could be in the operating theatre. If you're, medical staff, it could be in a busy team meeting. It could be having to make a decision in front of a board. Yeah. So on the pitch, does that mean something else in the US?
Yeah. So we don't know what on the pitch means over here.
Oh, on the field?
Perfect. Okay. But yes, it applies to the OR, to the boardroom, to the surgical holding area, everything you just said. I just wanted to make sure our listeners understood.
Okay. Cool.
So you were about to share, before I so rudely interrupted, about that beginning of training and learning the skills to be in the moment and witnessing the moment. Talk more about that, please.
Yeah. The key skill here is called decentering. Can you distance yourself from your inner state? So if you're feeling frustrated or lonely or bored or anxious, can you develop a curiosity to say, this is not me? So for example, rather than saying, I am angry, how about saying, I am feeling anger? And just notice the difference between defining yourself with the state, I am angry, to I am feeling angry. So it is visiting me, right? It's incredible when you decenter yourself from this inner state. The brain immediately relaxes because you've given your inner state a name. I once worked with a leader who was in the middle of a SFO, serious fraud inquiry, investigation in the US. She was the head of a big bank. What she did every morning, Lee, she got out of the shower and went to her mirror, which was all misted up. She tuned into how she was feeling right now. And in the mist on her mirror, she would draw emojis of how she was feeling right now. It took her 5 minutes every morning. And, by naming her inner state, by putting it outside of her, it lost its capacity to have a grip over her. And she did that every day. So the message here is, what can we develop a practice that every day we have a little discipline of noting down our inner state, whatever that might be. And so it is this capacity to be here right now, to tune into what's going on for you. So whatever that might be. I have a journal, I can write down how I am feeling right now. And the moment the brain feels you identifying your inner state, as I said, it loses its grip on you. So that's just one thing, one piece of advice.
I think that's brilliant, because small micro habit formation that can shift your perceptions. And this idea of 5 minutes out of every day, whether it's drawing on a foggy mirror or journaling or just closing your eyes for a minute and naming and articulating. I think that's very easy and powerful for busy physicians and administrators to do. So thank you for that tool.
I think the other thing is, what do you do in an uncontrolled, unplanned incident? Okay, so this is when your, the routine goes out the window. And again, my advice here would be to take just a brief time out. I was once working with an organization who sadly had a fatality incident. It was a high risk construction site. And the management team had to take a split decision about what to do. The families were wanting one thing. The media were asking something else. All of their health and safety people were saying, don't yet go in because the site is unsafe. And they had to take a split decision in a very, very, very stressful environment. And they couldn't agree on what should we do now. Do we go in to take the bodies out, or do we leave them and wait for the site to become safer? It was a really horrendous situation to be in. Anyway, they'd been through this leadership training, and what they did was they all took a mindful walk outside for 10 minutes this time. Again, tuned in to what was going on for them internally, tried to get on the balcony, and they came back in and they all shared one word about their inner state, and secondly, what they felt the decision would be. And just that little time out, that little walk outside, helped them make a very, very big, tough decision together. So at times, I call it hit the pause button. Stop. Get out. Just distance yourself a bit. Again, it's called this distancing, the capacity to distance oneself from the intensity of the experience. Come back in, and then they could make a very, very, very tough decision. So that's just another example, I guess, of how to train one's mind to be able to notice and regulate one's inner state.
Well, that's really powerful, because there is neuroscience about the physical activity and what that can do to set and reset where your mind is functioning, and it can release some of those trappings. Just that brief physical movement, as opposed to sitting and chatting or having this debate. And then use of distance, as you say, you physically remove yourself from that environment. The movement is occurring, and you're able to step outside of it and then be able to come back to the issue. I think that's really helpful.
That reminds me, Lee, I once worked with a CFO, a chief financial officer. Again, he'd done this stuff around mindfulness and leadership with me, and he changed all of his meetings to stand-up meetings rather than sitting down meetings. Halved his meeting time. As a CFO, he liked to monitor numbers and data, and actually led to more creative and powerful decision making, because the hormones in the body, when we stand up, we're more alert, than when we're sitting down. So I love this thing about how it's, as you say, it's the micro thing. Just your physical posture can change your inner state. Once your inner state is changed, your outer action becomes more effective.
That's very true. And most of us in hospital settings do a stand-up safety huddle just for a few minutes. We're all standing and we're sharing what happened in the last 24 hours and focusing on safety in the moment. And it works exceptionally well. I would agree with you. So just from practical experience. So let's talk a little bit about your book. And it seems to me that what I ascertain is that you describe how leaders get stuck between what ought to be and what is. And I want you to tell us a little bit more about this concept and about the book and what you hope that these messages convey.
Yeah, there were many impulses and triggers, I guess, that led me to write the book. But 35 years or so in the field of change, I wanted to really try and sum it up into one statement. Sometimes when you've dealt with lots of complexity, and it's the simplicity of boiling something down to 4 words that actually say so much. So change starts by acknowledging what is, not by striving for what we wish or believe the situation ought to be. So this capacity to welcome in truth and reality as a far more effective catalyst of movement and flow and ease than always wishing for the current situation to be elsewhere. If only it wasn't pouring with rain today. If only. Yeah, that's the ought mindset. And our oughts, which is really, what is we believe is desired or expected rather than what is, they come from a good place. So in the book, I write about where do our oughts, our codes about how to be or how the situation needs to be, where do these ideologies come from? Because they're dividing the world at the moment. And certainly, your side of the pond.
Yes, we'll get into that, surely.
The oughts that are flying around, but oughts harden the ground. Your ought, Lee, always makes part of the world wrong.
And
Oughts
why? And is that, in your opinion, with your archaeology background and your anthropology, is that just the way we're wired? Is that nature? Is that nurture? Tell me more about where do those oughts come from, in your opinion?
From both. Let's start with nature. I write in the book about how oughts they have a survival function. They are a function of our need to belong. So as infants, we wouldn't grow into becoming adults unless we learnt to watch, particularly our mother's face, and discover, when does she smile at me? What am I doing? Because that's going to condition me as to what ought to be done in this family. Because if I don't make her smile, I might be kicked out. So we are wired for survival. We follow the codes of our primary carers, and we think, aha, that makes me feel innocent in this setting. That makes me feel guilty. I've done something wrong. And when we feel we've done something wrong or said something that's an offense or taboo, the risk is we might get kicked out. And if we get kicked out, as we know, we won't be able to survive. The human species won't survive unless we can belong to a tribe. So the primary oughts come from our upbringing. But as we become adults, nurture kicks in. And then other oughts come their way. It could be our educational background. I'm just reading a book at the moment. It's not here. It's called Little Sad Men, about the British public school boarding system, private school for the US, about how the oughts of stiff upper lip, don't talk about your mother, put all of your emotions to one side. And a lot of those people now are running our country.
Yeah.
So we then acquire oughts through the kind of education setting we were put in. And belonging to that tribe and conforming is much more important than pursuing truth and reality. So we sign up to the codes of the tribe. Of course, in the medical profession, you have the Hippocratic Oath. Have I said that right?
Yes, you did.
So we then acquire our oughts through professional training. How one ought to behave around here. What are we loyal to? Oughts are about loyalties. What do I have to comply with? What do I have to be loyal to here? And if I'm not loyal to these codes, I will get kicked out. So that's why oughts have such a grip on our lives. They really are, they govern what we have to believe to be true.
That's very helpful. I imagine you're familiar with James Collins, the author of Good to Great.
Yes.
Well, I teach physicians about chief medical officer roles and responsibilities, and I use the Stockdale paradox, which was brought to light by James Collins, about how to face reality and complex truths honestly without giving up hope. The thoughts that are expressed by Admiral Stockdale's message, he was imprisoned in Hanoi during the war with Vietnam, and he said, and I think I'm quoting Jim Collins, quoting Stockdale, "You must never confuse faith that you will prevail in the end, which you can never afford to lose, with the discipline to confront the most brutal facts of your current reality, whatever they might be." And there's some parallel I'm feeling with what we're talking about, that what you're referencing, that there is what I want it to be. I hope we get out by Christmas. Oh, I hope we get out by Easter. I hope they release us back to the United States. And yet the brutal facts are today we're still in prison. And we just have to not confuse our faith that we will prevail and we will get out, as opposed to wishing for these almost false narratives in our mind. Does any of this resonate with you at all?
It does. I think there are similarities, and I'd also like to highlight a few distinctions as well. There are similarities. I remember reading From Good to Great. In fact, when I came up with the title From Ought to Is for my book, I did have, from Good to Great in my mind. So the similarity is I was taught, it's called the Robert Fritz model of change, which is current reality and desired future. And the creative tension between these two, great leadership is about holding the two together. Face current reality, hold the desired results, the future. And the moment you reduce the desired results, you lose your ambition. The moment you sort of gloss over current reality and try to bring it up here, like when I get on the scales and I think maybe if I, don't eat the day before, I'll think I'm don't weigh so much weight. We're in denial. So great leaders hold this tension between the facts of today and the aspirations of tomorrow and explore the gap, but do it in a creative way. So it is similar to that. But I learned that 35 years ago when I was teaching change management around the world at Shell. What I've learnt, though, since then, Lee, and this is through a lot of my work in systemic change and organizational learning, is that there's a false dichotomy between the here and now and the future. As if the here and now, we just got to get through it, right? As opposed to acknowledge, include, honor, respect. So, and that's quite a challenging thing for us to do. I'm not saying we should roll over and just accept fate and, I'm not going to try and get out of this prison. And so it's not about giving up hope, but it's about truly honoring where you are now and not being complaining about it or upset by it, but by fully being able to be with what is. I don't know if that makes any sense, but it's not a tolerant attitude, but it's a profound inclusion. Include everything that's happening, even if it's unsettling, unexpected, uninvited, and you would rather be in a different place. And I'm not sure whether the Stockdale paradox includes that, but for me, it's this profound compassion for the here and now, not just judgment about it. I don't know whether that makes any sense.
It does. And I'm not claiming that anybody has really unpacked the Stockdale paradox in as much as it's just a somewhat easy and memorable way of appreciating not to lose hope and to keep faith about things that we do idealize, but not get distracted or delusional about that at the same time, because that will be disappointing in many ways. And I guess where I'm hoping to go with this right now is in the context of physician leadership education, where across the world, many physicians have become intolerant of the way things are, and they have emotionality, to your point. They feel depressed, but maybe they aren't. And I don't mean clinical depression, and they feel burnout. And I don't mean a sense of the inventory of burnout, but that they don't step back and then declare it as I am feeling it. They just say, I'm depressed or I'm burnt out. So as a physician, leader, educator, how do we help train and teach those aspiring leaders about the things that might block or distort and help them face the is without losing hope, without compromising values, and not to be tone deaf to the weight that their colleagues are feeling that make them burnt out or apathetic, even where they just check out. They say, I can't work in this environment. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, my thoughts on that is how to confront reality in a way where you're not judging reality. The moment we complain, we get weaker as a leader. Complaints weaken people. You lose agency when you're complaining. Okay, so that's not a leadership skill to complain about the situation. So somehow you have to find it in yourself to acknowledge what's going on and to have conversations in a way where you don't put blame or judgment. The moment you start to fight the system will fight back. I once saw a leader about 2 or 3 weeks ago, Lee, confronting a system and a chief executive of the system that seemed very, very stuck. And was causing a lot of stress for the organization. And a coach came in to work with this CEO who was creating this quite toxic environment. And everybody had tried to convince this person that they should do it a different way. This person came in and said, what I see you doing is passionately caring for the success of this institution. And because I see your care, I want to join in that care and name how I'm seeing the situation. The moment that intervention was done, and this was on an online meeting, the CEO started to soften and hear the influence of what was trying to be said. Do you see the distinction there between sort of really using your ideology or your judgments to sort of like criticize things by looking at, okay, what's the loyalty behind this system? As an anthropologist, I'm trained every system makes perfect sense to itself. This is the hardest thing about this work, Lee, is to work without judgment.
I think you
How
are
to work without judgment.
you are articulating something that is not, first of all, it's not a Western mindset. To your earlier comments, that we are somewhat brought up by nature and nurture, and depending on those circumstances, we will sit in judgment almost as a default mechanism to survive whatever experience is happening to us. I would predict, and I'm not a student of this, that more Eastern mindsets they're a little less likely to sit in judgment, but Western thinking has a lot of judgmental approaches. So that is a real challenge. Any thoughts on, again, how leaders strive to educate and shape people to be less judgmental?
Yeah. And it's got to be two-way. How can you influence not just your own behavior, but the behavior of the system? This thing about empathy, how can you stand in somebody else's shoes and see the system from that place? Not necessarily to agree with it, but to somehow agree to it. There's a real difference between agreeing with something and agreeing with somebody and having to agree to it at some level. And I was working with a city council here in the UK, and there was a real battle, in the sense, from the elected members who were, the politicians, and the salaried staff, the council, the managers. And they were getting stuck around the budgets and what spending should go to which departments. And it was really very, very polarizing. But we worked on an intervention whereby literally they all stood up in a room together, the people who'd been elected and the people who were employed. They stood in a line and looked at each other. All they did, going back to what you're saying earlier about body and movement. And then they walked across, like sort of walking across the aisle to the other side to fully stand in that place to register, does it feel different standing here? When I'm standing here, does my body pick up different impulses? And when I look back at me, now represented by somebody else, how do I see that position? And they did this, a series of moves. And I'm not saying that this solves everything, but it's a technique whereby can you distance yourself from your position, stand alongside another part of the system, and look back with understanding rather than necessarily, as I said, agreement with the situation. So I've got another, I'll let you respond to that, but I've also got another little great technique whereby you can learn to act without judgment. But this thing about really draining yourself of evaluation to stand alongside everything. And I do like the distinction between agreeing to something and agreeing with something. It's very, very different. The moment you exclude something, it'll only get more angry with you. Inclusion quietens the system down.
I think that you
agree with.
just helped me conceptualize an idea, and I want your reaction to this. So in our academy, I use a lot of active role-playing scenarios where I take the physician leaders, I make them a chairman of the board, I make them a member at large, and I help them see what it is like to sit on a governance board of a healthcare system. I also take them out of their comfort zone and ask them to be the CFO or the CEO or the chief legal counselor of the hospital and role play for 60 or 90 minutes. And we do a debrief like a living laboratory role play. So they at least begin to have an awareness of what those other shoes feel like. I don't know that anybody here in the States would be comfortable swapping sides, even in an informal gathering. But I would love for that to happen. But what I do, here's the idea though. After we do some role playing, because this is common in the States, that the CEO will show up in scrubs and make rounds and go to the intensive care unit or to the emergency department and spend a day with the staff, getting a feel for the actions, the activities, the frustrations, the barriers, the obstacles, and then goes back and makes notes and tells some strategy officer or clinical operations officer, we need to fix this problem in the emergency department. But we rarely do the other. In fact, I'm not aware, and I hope that somebody is doing this, where we take the physician leaders and we put them in the C-suite for the day. We put them in the boardroom for the day, swear them to silence naturally, but find out what pressures these non-clinical leaders are facing. And then maybe the physicians can say, there might be a solution for that, by the way. Does this make any rational sense to you?
Complete. I don't know whether you know the book Barry Oshry, Seeing Systems, which is wonderful. He writes about power dynamics in systems and how he calls it the anxious tops. They're usually the people who have all the responsibility and all the stress. The confused middles, the people who are saying, if only they up there can actually give us better direction, I can manage my teams on the front line much better. He then has the oppressed bottoms, the people who tend to then join the union and they let's join up and we'll fight against everything because we're hard done by, and the frustrated customers. Anyway, but I run power simulations whereby I get people to literally, as you're saying, take something out of a hat and you're the CEO or you're this or you're that. And you can't get whole system change unless you have whole system empathy. It's impossible. The parts will only shout louder and not see, the other perspective. So, but I do go back to my book From Ought to Is. I think that has to be precededly, if I was doing a leadership training course, by this thing about identifying your oughts. What oughts do you carry, really? Can you put your loyalties out there?
That's very interesting. Again, I'm not sure it is easier said than done, I'll bet. I'll bet you've not struggled. I bet you've encountered resistance to this.
I do. I have 4 sheets of paper: family, politics, my profession, and my nation or culture. And just as an example, do I have any oughts from my family? Do I have any oughts that might be faith-based? Anything that's come from my profession or training, and anything that's come from where I grew up, my culture. You talked about East and West, maybe having different oughts. And then you prioritize them. Which are more important to me? Which oughts truly demand my compliance? So I might, have a professional affiliation, but do you know what? What I've learned from my faith clashes with the ought from my profession. That's really tough. So it's very hard to sort of, you got to do these 2 moves together, Lee. You've both got to understand the other perspective, but start with yourself. How have I been programmed? What's really important to me?
I've heard executive leaders that for whom I have respect, that they frame it like this. It's not a either or, it's a yes and. It's holding 2 thoughts at the same time and loosely, holding many thoughts loosely. For example, I have questioned members of Congress here, which would be the equivalent of the House in Parliament. How did you take an oath to become a practicing physician, and now you have an oath to the United States Constitution? And which oath do you choose, and how do you switch from one to the other. And perhaps the best answer is I try to do both simultaneously to the best of my ability. And it's not a choice that I struggle, because all that does is create that tension, and that tension is unsustainable. And that's a challenge. I'm not presupposing that I have any bright solutions, but am I clarifying this right in the way that you're describing this?
Yeah, what I call contingent. So the context drives how we prioritize. So we can't be absolute about our oughts. So dependent on our context, we might choose an ought, that might have a different nuance to an ought that's important in this context. But again, going back to the brain and the neurosciences, the moment we can map them, identify them, understand their conflict, again, you're acting more out of awareness rather than reactive stress, I guess.
No, that's very helpful. And here in the U.S., to that, sort of along the lines of thinking about institutional or organizational change, particularly in healthcare, where I think you mentioned this, something called busy action, where there's lots of change initiatives, and there's true movement, deep shifting. In the U.S., we call it the BSO phenomenon, the bright shiny object of the moment, right? And how do we recognize or measure our movement versus the indicators? Like, we love in U.S. healthcare metrics about our patient outcomes, our error rates, and all of these little micro measurements, but they don't necessarily capture that deeper culture change, that compassion, that empathy, that adaptive capacity, right? So the leaders are chasing these bright, shiny objects, and there's too much change, and we never can sit still for a moment to take 5 minutes, to take a walk around the block, to step back. I suppose that we need to hear more about how to create sustainable and adaptable minds around change. And I'm curious. I'm throwing a lot at you, but maybe you have some thoughts on the matter.
Yeah. What bait will I go for first? Well,
see, I'm acting like a U.S. healthcare executive. I'm throwing everything at you and see what sticks.
No, I enjoy this. I love talking about corporate or institutional acupuncture.
Oh, go, please. Sounds great.
Versus, surgery, which is a more drastic intervention. But in acupuncture, I'm sure, it's more alternative medicine, granted, more Eastern school of thought. But you go for you choose a minimally invasive intervention. So you believe that the system, the body, has its innate energies, and your task is to know what's the fewest things I need to do around here that will have maximum energizing effect on the system. Because very often one point has lots of intersections with other points as well. So when we're in busy action, as you say, we throw a lot of stuff, initiatives keep rolling out. I say, whoa, hold on a minute. Let's really get to where I call where these ripest needs are. And rather than keep launching stuff, do change in a quieter way. Really go for the 2 or 3 things that are creating most unease. And I mean, silly little, well, not silly, but an example earlier was this guy who just had stand-up meetings. That's an acupuncture example, whereby a minimally invasive change, you didn't have to bring in consultants, right? And launch a big change program. But just that little thing made a whole difference to the quality of decision-making, culture, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's one thing I'll say about the difference between action and movement. If you're going for movement, you go for the fewest things that have the highest leverage. So that's the first thing about that. I don't know whether that's stimulated anything for you.
I love that. And how might one begin to train or teach or coach leaders to think about sort of these timeout moments, these identification of feelings, these stand-up moments, the walk around the block moments, the minimally invasive. How do we begin to affect that change for leaders? Tell me what you think about that. How do we begin this work?
What I think is really important is the task for leaders is can you help the system see itself? your task as a senior leader is not to do the change. You'll have even more burnout. You've got your own functional responsibilities, and then you've got a leadership responsibility to bring about change. So how do you have the system look in the mirror collectively? Because the moment we have reality in the room that is collectively held, we get movement. The task is not to run away, get some consultants in, and launch another program. So that's the first thing I'll say. Can be as simple as this, Lee. Again, I was working with a group once. They had a bunch of about 100 people in the room, cross-section of the institution. And at the start of the day, they would run what's called a soft shoe shuffle. Somebody was actually from the deep south, and she called it a moccasin. Is it moccasin? The soft shoes, what they're called. Anyway, and the whole group sat in a circle and were invited to really tune in and become present to what was going on inside them right now, particularly that which was feeling disturbing or unable to be talked about, but which they knew would unlock change. And then they invited an individual to stand up and, in clean, simple language, non-judgmentally, state what's going on. And then the soft shoe shuffle was, if you agreed with that statement, you would stand up and you would walk towards that person. And then somebody else spoke up, and then somebody else spoke up. And gradually, and this happened with 100 people in 15 minutes, we had clustered into the 3 or 4 big things that this group needed to tackle. Incredible in terms of collective system behavior. Another way of doing it, a senior leader says, all right, let's have some feedback now about yesterday and what should be on the agenda today. And the usual voices speak up and everybody talks from the ought. Well, I think today we ought to look at strategy or whatever that might be. That's not confronting what is. So the soft shoe shuffle is just an example of how can you quickly get a system collectively naming reality. And it's such a deep moment when that happens in the room.
Yeah, well, as you alluded to earlier, we have some difficulties in our current state over here in the U.S., and I imagine it's not any different in other parts of the world. You've mentioned the polarity and the polarization that we are experiencing, and I would shout out to those that are doing that work, that are creating that psychological safety, that vulnerability, putting people in the room and beginning to appreciate that we are much more alike than we are different. And when we hold the oughts and the judgments, then we see the differences. And if we suspend those beliefs and begin to work collectively, and I'm not talking about collectivism or socialism, but that we are more alike, and those polarities can come down and we can create consensus. That is an aspiration I would choose to walk for in this country, but I think we have a lot of work in front of us. Your reaction to that?
Yeah, well, I will join you in that, Lee. Flying the flag for that. And, the most important thing is how to do that in a way that it doesn't come across as moralizing.
Yeah.
It's really hard.
Yeah. This is hard. Look, leadership is hard. It's in fact very hard. And I quote my friend every time I say that, who taught me that. It's very hard. Listen, before we wrap up, one last thing about education. I was recently called a Sherpa, a term used by someone familiar with your work who was using it to describe, how you've described it, and they applied it to me. And I think, and I wrote down this quote: faculty who act less as experts and more as Sherpas, as the educational equivalent of Sherpas, people able to carry part of the load in order to guide participants toward their personal and organizational summits. So if I'm a Sherpa, it is in no small part because you have been the lead Sherpa to the rest of us trying to make change in the world. And for that, I'm forever thankful for you and what you do to contribute to making the world a better place. I appreciate you. I appreciate you being on the show. And maybe if some of us continue to be Sherpas and we bring some of those polar opposites together, maybe we make some real progress. So this has been a delight. I'll give you some closing thoughts or commentary for our listeners.
Yeah, no, it's lovely to end in the concept. Never thought of this before as a meta Sherpa.
There you go.
I'm going to write that down. I think that's an extraordinarily beautiful way to describe my mission and my ministry in the world. So thank you for allowing me to And let me say two final things about Sherpas, which you didn't mention. One is Sherpas are needed on dangerous journeys. So you hire them, when you're going through some real danger that you can't do yourself. So Sherpas help people go through difficult terrain. So Sherpas, it's not an easy ride. Yeah. Oh, Sherpas are about being nice and helping a group. The final thing, getting a group into facing difficulty in reality is tough. Much easier to do a lecture to a group. The final thing I'll say about Sherpas is the Sherpas in the Himalayas, they treat their role as a sacred activity. And when they reach their goal, or the summit of Everest, if it's going up that mountain, there's always a ceremony. This is my anthropology coming through, to honor the path that's being taken together. So I just wanted to bring in perhaps an element of the sacred into this task of being a Sherpa.
I think that is so beautiful, that there is a sacred duty, a sacred experience, if you will, and then they give thanks and give prayers to that extraordinary moment. That's incredible. Well, this has been an incredible show. And for all of you out there, you have been listening to the Fire Chief Podcast, the only podcast dedicated to the Chief Medical Officer. Want to learn more about what it is like to be a CMO? Check out our website, thefirechiefcmo.com, and connect with me on LinkedIn. I love talking with CMOs, especially the ones that are helping to advance their physician leaders every day. So get out there, be a chief, or perhaps do the harder thing and be a Sherpa. And in the words of Sergeant Phil Esterhaus, don't forget, let's be careful out there.